to be with you this evening. We've got a really exciting talk to look forward to tonight. Brian Edwards is with us. Brian was a pastor for many years in the UK in Surrey. I'll let Brian introduce himself in a minute, but Brian has spoken for a long time for Answers in Genesis in the UK and in the US, doing apologetics work for us. And so tonight, Brian is going to be speaking on the New Testament, an authentic and reliable book, specifically looking at Luke, the historian. So I understand from Brian, this is a new talk, so there's going to be lots of good stuff to hear in this talk tonight. So Brian, thank you for joining us this evening. Do you want to begin and just introduce yourself, and then you can get on with your talk?
Thank you, Simon, and good evening, everyone. It's good to be with you wherever you are, in your home or wherever, and I'm delighted to be with you on this occasion. Yes, I'm Brian Edwards, and as Simon says, I was in the Christian pastorate for many years. I have a ministry now of writing, editing, and this kind of lecturing, if you want to call it a lecture, but it'll be more just of a talk this evening. I live in Dunstable, Bedfordshire in the UK with my wife Rosie, and we're members at Christ Church Dunstable, which is an FIEC church. Let's get right into our subject this evening, because many of you will know that people often believe the Bible can't be trusted because it's not really history in the true sense. You see, one of the great things about the Bible, both the Old and the New Testament, is that it's packed full with history. And people say, yeah, but of course it's just a mixture of error and fables, isn't it? Well, there are generally two reasons for that, I find. One is that sadly, they've never seriously read the Bible, so they don't know. And the other is that they simply accept what they've been told. Now, we're going to narrow our focus right down to one person. We're going to narrow it down to Luke in his Gospel and Acts. And it may surprise you to know that in the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament, that is just over 1/4 of the entire New Testament, 27% to be exact. Now, full of history, both the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. If Luke is shown to be a reliable historian in his Gospel and Acts, then we can trust his record of the life of Jesus and the early Christian church. And that really is what we're going to do. But just before we get to Luke, I want to introduce you to Simon. No, not Simon Turpin, Simon Greenleaf. Simon Greenleaf was one of the founders of the Harvard Law School in the USA. And in the last 10 years or so before his death, from 1842 to 1853, he published 3 volumes on a treatise on the law of evidence. This is still being published, and it's been called the greatest single authority in the entire literature of legal procedure. And I'm telling you this because it's still the basis of legal procedure on the law of evidence. Let me show you what I mean. Here's an outline of his 5 main points on the law of evidence. First of all, documents have a right to be taken as true unless they are proven otherwise. Keep this in mind, and bear in mind we're talking about Luke, the gospel writer, and the Acts of the Apostles. They're his documents. Secondly, the author has a right to be considered trustworthy unless proven otherwise. Third, the number of independent witnesses confirms the greater accuracy of the report. Fourth, the agreement of their evidence enhances the truth of the record. And fifth, their reliability is confirmed by known events. Well, there's your 5 points, and you've just read 3 volumes on the law of evidence. Let's apply that just for a moment to the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. The 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, have never been proven inaccurate. That's a statement we can make and we can back up. Secondly, the author has a right to be considered trustworthy. The writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were writers of known integrity, men of honesty. Their writing shows that, and there's not a word against them. Thirdly, there are 4 independent gospels. If God had given us 1, people would have said, you're relying on just 1 gospel. So God has given us 4, and in fact 5 if you count Paul's comments on the resurrection. Fourthly, their evidence never contradicts each other. Hold on, I know people suggest that, but it isn't true. They never contradict each other. And fifthly, their historical details, as we're about to see, are confirmed by known history. That was Simon Greenleaf. But this is what Luke himself says. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled amongst us, just as they were handed down to us from those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. Notice those expressions? Eyewitnesses, carefully investigated, the certainty of the things you have been taught. And when he began his Acts of the Apostles, he writes to the same man, Theophilus. We don't know who Theophilus was. I wrote all about that Jesus began to do and to teach, and the many convincing proofs. Well, we were looking at Simon Greenleaf, but Luke has never been shown to be inaccurate, and much of his work matches with known texts and inscriptions of the first century. In his Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles, Luke refers to no less than 114 towns, provinces, islands, seas, and other identifiable places, and 25 political, military, social, or religious events, all of which are actually known to history. These are not made up, these are not fables, these are not storylines, they're all known to history. He mentions the famine in Judea in Acts 11 and the expulsion of the Jews from Rome in the time of Claudius, the Roman emperor. He refers to that in Acts 18, both of which are found in first century texts. And then to cap it all, he mentions 117 living people by name. Many of them are well-known people of history. Some we don't know, they just flit across the stage. But many of them are well known. Again, we'll see that in a moment. Now, it's pretty obvious that Luke was happy for his readers to check him out. He didn't mind you saying, are these people real? Let's have a look at them. He was happy for that. And to have got all that detail in. Remember, he was a physician by profession. So he was a man of clinical analysis. He must have had a notebook. Hey, hang on, a notebook in the first century? Well, here is a first century notebook. Now here's a good idea. Take a few thin slithers of paper, parchment, or wood, and punch a couple of holes in the bottom, put a ring through it, and you've made a ring binder. This was first century technology. Now, the Greeks didn't have a word for this new piece of technology, so they stole the Latin word membrane, from which we get, of course, our word membrane. And that's what it was called. This is a membrane. And when Paul was writing to Timothy in 2 Timothy 4, verse 13, and he says, bring some of my personal goods with you when you come, Timothy. Oh, and don't forget the scrolls, and most translations have something like parchments. The word that Paul uses was membrane. Paul was using a notebook. Now, people in the first century were more literate than we believe. Every Jewish boy could read. People were reading history, poetry. They were reading drama, philosophy, medical and agricultural practices. And the walls of Pompeii, the city devastated by Vesuvius in 79 AD, there are literally thousands of inscriptions, political, advertising, love notes, and of course the erotic as well. And this is Terentius, Nero, and his wife, the local bakers at Pompeii. They are not just any old baker. She has a writing pad in front of her, and she's holding a stylus in her hand, and he's got a scroll. We are educated bakers, you must understand. Sometimes you'll read these kind of statements. It is incontrovertible, that means you can't argue against it. It is incontrovertible that in the early period there was only an oral record of the narrative and saying of Jesus. Can you imagine that this Jesus of Nazareth, This rabbi who did such incredible miracles, taught such beautiful things, lived such an incredible life, nobody ever thought of writing anything down. Forget that. It just doesn't figure. It doesn't stand up to what we actually know to be the truth. Oh, might be a little while before we get into Luke, I know, but I want to introduce you to somebody else. Sir William Ramsay. Now, he's what I call a bucket and spade archaeologist. He lived from 1851 to 1935, and he was a pretty bright guy, as you can see. He was professor at Oxford and Aberdeen universities, gained 3 honorary fellowships from Oxford, 9 honorary doctorates from British continental and American universities, the Victoria Medal of the Royal Geographic Society in 1906, founder member of the British Academy, and he was knighted in 1906 for his services to archaeology. Now, he began his work as an archaeologist being taught that he would find Luke in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, wrong everywhere. So, what did he discover? This was his conclusion. He said, "You may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historians, and they stand the keenest scrutiny and the hardest treatment. Christianity did not originate in a lie, and we can and ought to demonstrate this as well as believe it." And if you want a more modern day professor, the late Professor F.F. Bruce, Professor of Biblical Criticism in Manchester University, if Luke's trustworthiness is vindicated in points where he can be checked, we should not assume that he is less trustworthy where we can't test his accuracy. So let's have a look at Luke, shall we? We got there at last. Your introduction to his history is in Luke chapter 2. He mentions Caesar Augustus and the census. And the number of people have criticized that, saying the Caesars didn't order a census. Well, let me dispense that. Sir William Ramsay discovered that actually there were regular censuses in the Roman Empire. Every government wants to know who's going to pay the taxes. And then the Bible says, Luke says, everyone went to his own town to register. Oh, that's a huge upheaval. Imagine if you all had to go back to your birthplace before you could even vote. Well, I'm sorry, but that's exactly what they did. What you're looking at is a census order by the Egyptian Roman governor in Egypt, Gaius Maximus, in AD 104, ordering all men to return to their home for a census. So no one really can query that. But here's the biggie, and if I didn't mention it, some of you would. You see, Luke talks about the census in the time of Quirinius, when Quirinius was governor of Syria at the time of the census. Now, there was another census in AD 6, and Luke refers to that in Acts 5:37, so he's well aware of it. But the Jewish historian Josephus, he also claims that Quirinius was governor in AD 6. And that's why, of course, Luke records in chapter 2 and verse 2 of his gospel, this was the first census in the time of Quirinius. Luke is careful. He knows there's another one coming up. But here's the problem. Josephus agrees with the census around 6 BC. That's around about the time of Jesus' birth. But he claims that actually the administrative governor of Syria was not Quirinius, but Sentius Saturninus. Who was right? Well, actually, they both were. Here's the answer. An inscription that Sir William Ramsay found shows that Quirinius was the military governor in Antioch in Syria in 8 BC. He was still there in 6 BC when the census was given. But that was a senior post, the military governor, and Quirinius was away fighting raiding bands. Therefore, Sentius carried out his duties for him. Quirinius's census, but Sentius carried it out. That's cleared up that one. Now, Luke then goes on in chapter 3 to mention Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate, Herod, the Tetrarch of Galilee, Philip, the Tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, he's got that right, Lysanias, the Tetrarch of Abilene, and the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. And there's a reason historically why he mentions 2 high priests when there can really only be one. Annas had been deposed, and Caius, his son-in-law, had been put on in his place. But Annas was really the power behind the throne. Now, every one of those names is confirmed by texts and inscriptions. He also mentions Tiberius Caesar. Now, Tiberius Caesar, of course, was the stepson of Augustus, Octavian, before he became Caesar Augustus. And Caesar Augustus was the Caesar at the time of Jesus's birth. Tiberius took over in AD 14. And when Jesus asked for a little coin to be shown him, they showed him a denarius, which in English money is about the size of a 5p piece, a very small coin. And he said, whose portrait and inscription is this? And this was Tiberius Caesar. He mentions Pontius Pilate, of course, who was governor of Judea. Now, no one doubts the existence of Pontius Pilate, but for a long time, the only evidence we had was in texts rather than hard copy. What you have on the right-hand side of your screen there is a stone that was discovered in what was a theater, and it was dedicated to Tiberius, and Caesar and Pilate got the credit for it. It refers to Pilate himself. And there's a little bronze coin minted in Jerusalem by Pilate in AD 31. And just as a bit of an aside, if you were making up these stories, why would you invent an argument among the disciples as to which of them would be greatest? These are the apostles. These are the disciples of Jesus, the chosen men. These are the foundation of the first church. And they had an argument, not once, but twice. Why put it in? Because it actually happened. And Luke was a man of honesty. And he was going to show the disciples to be men, warts and all. You wouldn't make that up for obvious reasons. Come to the Acts of the Apostles. It's packed with historical references all the way through. The death of Herod Agrippa, for example. Acts 12 reads like this. On the appointed day, Herod, wearing his royal robe, sat on his throne and delivered a public address to the people. They shouted, "This is the voice of a God, not of a man." Immediately, Luke comments, because Herod did not give praise to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died. Now, that's rather an expressive way, for obviously some terrible internal problems he had. But that's just what Luke says. Well, no, not quite. Josephus, the Jewish historian, as a contemporary around about the same time, he tells exactly the same account. But he adds a few details, that the sun was shining on Herod's robes. The people worshipped him as a god. Herod accepted this. Then he saw an owl, which was known then as an evil omen. And Josephus says he suffered violent stomach pains and died 5 days later. You see, the stories fit together. The records are true. Josephus and Luke both knew the account and they wrote it down. There are 4 Herods in Luke's writing in the Gospels, in the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles: Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, Herod Agrippa, and Herod Agrippa II. Herod Agrippa I was the one who ordered the death of James and the imprisonment of Peter and met that gruesome death. We won't delay on these, but just to say, he gets all these Herods in exactly the right place and gives them exactly their right titles. Saul of Tarsus stood by while the mob stoned Stephen, the first Christian martyr, to death. But when Saul was converted and became Paul the Apostle, he and Barnabas traveled on the first missionary journey recorded. Starts in Acts 13, and they arrive on Cyprus, where Luke is very careful to comment that when they arrived at Paphos in Cyprus, Sergius Paulus was the proconsul at Paphos. In fact, Luke goes on to say he was an intelligent man. Well, of course he was, because actually he accepted the gospel of Jesus Christ. An inscription discovered in 1877 near Paphos on Cyprus confirms that Sergius Paulus was proconsul in AD 47, the exact time that Paul was there. Fits perfectly. And then they came to Lystra. Now, here's a very interesting account. When the crowd saw that what Paul had done, Paul and Silas here had been used by God to heal some lame people. And the people shouted, "The gods have come down to us in human form." And they called Barnabas, he is the one who spoke, Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. Now, Zeus and Hermes were the equivalent Greek gods of Jupiter and Mercury. And there's a little story behind the gods have come down to us. And it's all about Philemon and Baucis. Jupiter, remember, he's the Roman equivalent of Zeus, and Mercury, the equivalent of Hermes. Jupiter, the chief god, decided to destroy everybody because they were so unsharing, so unkind, so greedy. But as a little test, Jupiter and Mercury dressed as human beings, and they went to Lystra. They asked for help. Every door was closed except a poor couple, Philemon and Baucis, and everyone else was destroyed, and Philemon and Baucis were reserved and rewarded. And from there on, the people were always afraid that they might miss the return of the gods. So when Paul and Barnabas came and did such wonderful things, they assumed the gods had come. That's the background to that little story. Oh, you can be sure Luke knew all about that. And that's why he was careful to record their words. The gods have come down to us in human form. And it was somewhat similar, you know, when they went to Athens. Now, Athens, of course, is the hometown of Athena. That's where the city gets its name from. She lived, the goddess Athena, she lived in the lovely temple that was made for her up there on the hillside, in the Parthenon, on the Acropolis. And the Acropolis is a word that simply means the high hill. Athens was known for its multiplicity of gods and shrines and altars. And in Greek folklore, Athens was suffering from a terrible plague and crying to all the gods, but they all failed, every one of them. And reluctantly, they sent for a poet and prophet from Crete of all places. Crete was despised, and his name was Epimenides. And he came and he offered a particular kind of sacrifice to a god, and the plague stopped. He refused any reward save only a treaty of peace between Athens and Crete, and he refused to give the name of his god. Now, all this happened many centuries before Paul came into the town. This was one of their legends. And the altars grew up, agnosto theo, unknown God. They had to make an offering for the God whom Epimenides never told them his name. Now that story comes not only from Luke, because he doesn't tell the story, but he knew it, but it comes from Plato and Aristotle and others. Actually, Epimenides, some of you may remember that Paul says something rather strong about the Cretans. Titus chapter 1. Titus is a pastor in Crete, and he says, you know, that even one of your own poets, that's Epimenides, claims that Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, lazy gluttons, and this testimony is true, with sincere apologies to anyone watching this who happens to live in Crete. I'm sure it's not true today. For 6 centuries, no one knew the name of this God, and Paul preached a sermon on it. He told them about creation. I'm going to tell you, he says, about the God who made everything in the beginning of time. I want to tell you how foolish your idolatry is and your ignorance because you didn't know this beforehand. But now you do know, and you're commanded to repent. And the proof of all this is the resurrection of Jesus. Now, Paul said all of that in his sermon. You can go and read it in Acts 17. And we're told some sneered, they still do. Others were interested, they still are. And a few believed. Thank God for that. You know, Luke is very exact very precise as a historian. We have in England town councils. It doesn't matter what town you go to, it's called a town council. It's pretty boring, pretty bland. There's nothing else but town council. But actually, in the first century across Asia Minor, they were all different. In Philippi, they were called strategoi. In Ephesus, they were called Asiakon. In Malta, they were the protos. And in Thessalonica, they were called politarchus. All different names, each place, only an eyewitness would know each proper name in the proper place. And Luke got it right. And as a matter of fact, in Thessalonica, the name later on changed, but a lump of stone that was discovered actually in Thessalonica in the 2nd century, 3rd century, actually begins with the same word, politarkunton, the politarchs of Thessalonica. Bit of a long mouthful. Luke's history, remember, Ramsay said, is unsurpassed in respect of its trustworthiness. He even gets the titles of the people right. And then a little passing comment. Chapter 18 and verse 2 of Acts, Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Now that covers a huge statement because actually it really upset thousands of people who had to leave Rome. The Roman historians Suetonius and Cassius Dio agree, quote, they were cast out, turned out of Rome by Claudius, the Roman emperor, since the Jews constantly made disturbances on the instigation of Chrestus, and he expelled them from Rome. There was obviously conflict going on. The Jews were in an uprising against Christians, and so he got rid of the Jews, and a lot of Christians would have had to have gone at the same time. It fits the history we know well. And he writes about Gallio, proconsul of Achaia, that's Greece. Now, Gallio, we know, was appointed by Claudius, the Roman emperor, in July AD 51, the exact year that Paul was in Corinth. And this lump of stone, an inscription found in 1905, refers to Gallio as proconsul in Achaia. And actually, it's an inscription that tells us he was trying to settle quarrels among the citizens. I wonder if that was the kind of upset that the gospel produced when it was preached among the Jews. And so to Ephesus, a great disturbance. Now, this is a model of the Temple of Diana of the Ephesians. Diana of the Ephesians was well known in Ephesus, and people traveled all over the Roman Empire to worship her. Ephesus was an important city of probably up to 500,000 people, and the glistening white marble temple of, she was known as Artemis, Diana to the Romans, Artemis to the Greeks. 100 magnificent columns, some of them beautifully carved, Artemis was the goddess of hunting and childbirth and little children and other things as well. And her temple was completed in 236 and destroyed by the Goths in 263. So it had been up a long time before Paul got there. It had its own parliament, and it was a place of refuge under the protection of the goddess. Pilgrims, I say, came from all over the world because they wanted to buy little statuettes. Here's one of Diana. And when the gospel came and challenged the foolishness of worshipping little gods like this, a little statuette, it caused a riot. And they cried, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." This was Sir Mob out in strength. And that phrase that Luke carefully records is exactly the phrase we know that was so often chanted for the little goddess Diana. I'm afraid what you're looking at is all that remains of Diana's temple today. Great is the god Diana. But where is Paul's gospel? All over the world. And so to Jerusalem. Now, something happened in Jerusalem that wasn't Paul's fault. He'd been seen in town with poor old Trophimus. Now, Trophimus was a Greek, a Christian, but a Greek. And somebody had thought or made up the fact that Paul had taken Trophimus into the temple precincts, and no Gentile, no non-Jew was ever allowed there. So a riot took place. Now, the cause of it was simply this, and this was discovered, a notice carved in stone and written in Greek for non-Jews, and discovered in 1871, discovered in Jerusalem, dated in the 1st century, and the words on there in Greek so that non-Jews could read it. Greek was the common language at that time, and they were painted in red. Some of the red pigmentation was there. And if I give you a red translation, this is what it read: "No foreigner may pass this barrier and enclosure surrounding the temple. Anyone who is caught doing so will be himself to blame for his resulting death." Now, that was what would have been well known and seen. Paul would have seen it, and there's no way Paul would have violated that and caused a disturbance. It was just somebody making up a story. It was just somebody causing trouble. But look at that stone for a moment and cast your eyes over the wording. That divided the Jew and the Greek, the Jew and the non-Jew. Do you not think that's what Paul had in mind when he wrote to the Ephesians, Jesus has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility? Culture, color, class, it's all broken down when people become Christians. That's what Paul was saying. But now, staying in Jerusalem, this riot was causing so much trouble that Claudius Lysias, the tribune in command of the cohort, rather assumed that Paul was going to be torn apart. So he sent in the Roman troops and brought him into the court for a trial, and said to him, were you not the Egyptian that caused a riot some time earlier? You see, what had happened, and Josephus, the Jewish writer, tells us that sometime before, there had been a riot led by an Egyptian. He gives him his name as well. There had been a riot, and the Egyptian had taken, well, Josephus says, 30,000 men onto the Mount of Olives. Felix, the governor, had ordered out the troops, killed 400, taken 200 prisoner, and the Egyptian, Ben Stada, we think his name was, escaped. Now, that figure of 30,000 by Josephus has got to be way over the top, because actually that would have outnumbered the entire Roman army in Judea. Luke gives it as 4,000, and that's much more correct. But here's the point. It laid bare an assassination plot. 40 Jews had decided they would fast until they had killed Paul. And a relative of Paul got wind of this and told Claudius. And they had requested that Paul be sent to Caesarea, which is downlined in the coast and was the military headquarters at this time. And there were some 74 miles to go, and they were going to ambush on the way. Well, Claudius Tribune was taking no chances at all. And he did something, and Luke is very careful to record it, something very interesting. He sent 3 groups of his soldiers. Now, the Roman army was divided into heavy infantry, cavalry, and lightly armed spearmen. And that is exactly the breakdown of the people who the Tribune sent. He sent 200 heavy infantry, 70 cavalry, and 200 lightly armed spearmen. And that lot accompanied poor little Apostle Paul all the way from Jerusalem to Caesarea. He knew the ambush position as well, because at Antipatris, halfway, some 40 miles down line, they arrived late at night. He was very careful to do it under cover of darkness. And he sent the infantry, the heavy infantry, back home and continued with the rest. Now, this was quite a long journey. And they did it in one night. And if you look at the space and the time, you think, hang on, these guys must have walked fast. Well, let me tell you this. A Roman legionary, complete with his 70 pounds of kit and weapons, you can only 70, that's 31 kilo for those of you for whom that's more useful. 31 kilo of kit and weapons. And remember, you can only take about 20 kilo on your airline. They could walk 23 miles in 5 hours with that kit on. A forced march would be 31 miles per day. They were marched all night to get Paul to Caesarea. And when they arrived, Felix was the governor of the Roman province, and Festus also succeeded him, both of which are known to history. And Herod Agrippa, he's mentioned in the account when Paul is on trial, he's known to history as well. And so we bring Paul to Rome. If you don't know the story, Paul, as a Roman citizen, had the right to appeal. Ultimately, if he wasn't getting justice, he had the right to appeal to Caesar himself, and Paul did. And so he was sent to Rome. Again, Luke is so careful. He not only named the tribune, but he names the centurion, Julius, a centurion of the imperial cohort. Now that's interesting because Rome had a cohort of officer couriers for communications between the emperor and the army, and Julius was this man sent with Paul. And they got on board a ship, something like this one, a Roman merchant ship. They requisitioned the opportunity for Julius and Paul and his soldiers on board. A Roman centurion could have anything between 80 and 100 men, but he didn't have to. He might have had less with him on this occasion, considerably less. Now, this is very interesting because if any of you know the Acts of the Apostles, you'll know that it ends with this climactic voyage that ends in shipwreck. But you may not know this, that a book was written, many years ago now, back in the 19th century, on this whole question of Paul's shipwreck and his voyage to Rome. Now, this is quite amazing. James Smith wrote a book, The Voyage and Shipwreck of Paul, 370 pages of it. You think, how could that possibly be? Well, I can assure you it is. I haven't got a copy, but I borrowed a copy. He was 60 years a professional sailor, educated at Glasgow University, a scholar in Greek, Latin, and many languages, and a student of geology and archaeology. He was an authority on ancient ships and shipping. And he wrote every detail and analyzed every detail of that story in the original Greek, and he looked at it with all the information that a man of his ability had. Luke's account of the voyage and shipwreck of Paul is considered the finest piece of eyewitness account of a shipwreck ever recorded and accurate in every detail. Of course, although I know some of them, I haven't time to tell you any of the details, but this was James Smith's conclusion. It's worth listening to. He says, no sailor would have written in a style so unlike that of a sailor. Okay, Luke was a doctor, not a sailor, so he couldn't write like a sailor. However, no man not a sailor could have written the narrative of the sea voyage consistent in all its parts unless from actual observation. You see, Luke includes the wind direction, the depth of the anchorage. He includes so many details. This peculiarity of style is to me in itself a demonstration that the narrative of the voyage is an account of real events written by a real eyewitness. A similar remark may be made on the geographical details. They must have taken place from an actual observation, for the geographical knowledge of the age was not such as to enable a writer to be so minutely accurate in any other way. Look, you could write a story of a shipwreck by getting maps and maritime maps and looking at the depth of the ocean and looking at where the sandbars were. You could make it up with all of that. None of that existed when Luke was writing his story. He had to have been there. And James Smith was saying, this writer had to have been there. It was an eyewitness account. Luke's account and Smith's description and his analysis are of the greatest significance for this reason. If this is the character of Luke as a historian, then his gospel and the rest of the Acts must be held in equal respect. If he writes accurate history where we can check him, remember what F.F. Bruce said, Professor Bruce? If he's accurate where we can check him, we have to respect where we can't check him. Sir William Ramsay, remember, you may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historians, and they stand the keenest scrutiny and the hardest treatment. Christianity did not originate in a lie, and we can and ought to demonstrate this as well as believe it. Which brings us almost to the end. Luke's final anticlimax. Here is this magnificent story of the tremendous things God did through his servant Saul of Tarsus, converted and becoming Paul the Apostle. Page after page, detail after detail, history after history. And then how do we finish up? For 2 whole years, Paul stayed in Rome in his own rented house. He was actually under house arrest, and welcomed all who came to see him boldly and without hindrance. He preached the kingdom of God and talked about the Lord Jesus Christ. What a wonderful way to conclude. Hey, but Luke, what happened to Paul? Luke doesn't tell us. Why not? Oh, well, you can make up your own reasons for that. Commentators have a field day. Maybe this was going to be part of Paul's defense before Nero, perhaps, who knows? Maybe he leaves it deliberately there because he didn't at that point want to make out Paul to be a martyr. Who knows? Maybe that's as far as Luke got when for some reason he was interrupted, or Paul was taken prisoner, and maybe Luke didn't live to see the end of the story. Who knows? But Tertullian, an early church leader, wrote that Paul had a death similar to that of John the Baptist, who was beheaded. Now, think about it. If Luke had known that, might it not have been a good thing to close off there in the martyrdom of the Apostle Paul? But he doesn't. He leaves it with an anticlimax. Look, when anybody's writing a book or a film, they always have a good opener and an important closer. How did Acts close? Paul is preaching the good news of Jesus to the very end. In his gospel, Luke spends 1 whole chapter reporting the resurrection of Jesus as a literal historical event, an event of real history. This, from the man whose accounts have been proved accurate wherever they have been tested. And for 2,000 years, Christians have been prepared to die for their certainty that Jesus is alive. And the evidence you have just seen demands a response. Christians from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries on were thrown into the arena to be gored by wild animals, crucified, set alight to illuminate the garden parties. They were prepared to die for their confident faith in Jesus as Savior, Lord, alive today. And they still are. When you look at the empty tomb of Jesus, this is not his tomb, but it's very like it. You're reminded that the resurrection of Jesus demonstrates who he is and what he came to do. Or as Paul put it when he was writing in the New Testament, Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. He was buried. He was raised on the 3rd day according to the scriptures. Thank you for listening. Just 2 books before we close, or I close. One is a very small pocket book. It will slip into a vest pocket, 44-page A6 booklet in full color, ideal as a frontline tract. Is it true? The resurrection of Jesus. The reasons why we know Jesus died on the cross and literally rose again. Oh, and more than that, why he died and why he rose. to take our guilt and sin upon himself and give us new life. And if you want something more meaty, a good coffee table book, a large hardback that will give you 250 pages with over 200 color pictures, easy to read, accessible, packed with frontline evidence. The evidence of archaeology authenticates and illustrates the Bible, lifting people and events from the pages of the Bible and setting them in the context of time and place. You can order both of these from either the publisher, Day One Publications, or why not get them from Answers in Genesis. And Simon can take you from there. Thank you. God bless you. Have a good evening.
Thanks, Brian. That's that's really important to know those details that you've been bringing up tonight. If you're still there, Brian, is it possible to stop sharing the screen, and I think people might be able to see both of us. Just for the folks that are watching, if you have a question you want to ask Brian on tonight's topic, either on the Gospels or Luke Acts, then please write it into the comment section really quickly, and we'll try and get to it. But Brian, let me ask you, how do you date Luke Acts? Are they written? When are they written, do you think?
Well, the beginning of Acts, of course, starts at just a matter of weeks after the resurrection of Jesus, because you have the account of Pentecost, and that was in the very year that, of course, Jesus died. We're talking in round terms 30 AD, just to make it easy and simple to remember. And it goes right on to, well, although we couldn't be sure of exactly the death of Jesus, of the Apostle Paul, it would have been somewhere in the region of 74 to 76 AD. So you've got that span, and each of the accounts, the records that you have when Paul is in Ephesus, when Paul is moved on to Troas, when he's in Corinth, and so on, we're able to date them very often, because when you've got a starting point, and we're told that 15 months later and so on, you can date it that way. But remember, in things like the inscription of Gallio, the inscription of Sergius Paulus on Paphos, those are actually datable. So you've got fixed dates for when Paul was actually there, because Luke says he was the governor at that time. So there are internal and external dating. Most of the dates in the Acts of the Apostles, we can be pretty close within, well, pretty sure of the actual year.
Yeah, great, thanks. We've had a question come in about, do we know anything about the later life of Luke, the Apostle Luke? Do we hear anything in other sources about what happened to the apostles?
Yeah, well, yes, all the apostles, there are not in the Bible. So what I'm about to say, none of this is in the Bible, apart from John, of course. John was probably the last one to die, but let's leave him aside for a moment. All the other apostles, there are legends, there are stories, some of which may be true. In fact, it's almost certain that some parts of them are true, because they all end up all over the world, as far away as India, and we don't know whether they actually were there. That's not part of the Bible. So yes, there are accounts of all the apostles in different places. John, for his part, of course, we do know that he was probably the last to die. Much later on in the first century, he might have been he was an old man when he died in Ephesus, and could have been the only one who died a natural death, because the legends of all the others give them a martyr's death. But as I say, we can't be certain of that. But we have the records of them, and that and John, of course, was exiled on the Isle of Patmos in the emperor's time, and that's when he wrote his final book in the New Testament, the book of Revelation, that God gave him on Patmos for the sake of the gospel. So yes, there are plenty of stories. You can even find them online if you want, but do remember, they're not part of guaranteed history. That's the difference with Luke. We can check him out, and we've got so many cross-references for him.
Yeah. Another question that we've got is to do with Jesus. Obviously, the four Gospels mention Jesus, but is there anything outside of the Gospels that mention Jesus? Because this is a question that often skeptics bring up. No one outside the New Testament mentions Jesus, and they'll say, well, if he was so important, why does no one mention him? Is that true?
Oh, no, it's certainly not true. Oh, incidentally, can I backtrack on the previous question? Then I'll come to this one. If anyone's really interested, if you go to Day One Publications, there's a little book called The Apostle. It's in the Little People series, God's Little People, and it's on the Apostles of Jesus. And you'll get all the traditions of them there. Coming back to this question, certainly not true that Jesus is only mentioned. The Jews mention him, and the interesting thing is that no one ever doubted his reality. You see, there are still Christ myth people around today, but that's a little bit like believing that the moon is made of green cheese, because all history runs in the opposite direction. It's not worth trying to defend the historicity of Jesus. Did he really live? It's much better to ask the question, okay, we know he lived. Here's the biggie. Who was he? And why did he come? But yes, the Jews mention him. They mention the things he did, but they put a different spin on it, of course. And Roman historians mention him. Tacitus, Suetonius mention him. There are Serapion and other pagan writers who hated Christianity and put all his miracles down to magic, Egyptian magic. But the one thing they didn't do is say that he didn't exist. They acknowledge he existed. No one in the first 3 centuries and beyond ever doubted that Jesus of Nazareth lived. Let's get that clear. That it's a nonsense to pretend he didn't live. Ask the question, not did he live, but who was he and what did he come to do?
Yeah. We've got another question about Luke, as I guess Matthew, Mark, and maybe Mark's gospel comes from the preaching of Peter, and John were all Jews, but Luke seems to be a Gentile. And as a Gentile, how does Luke understand Genesis, Brian? Does he accept Genesis?
Well, all the 4 gospels record Jesus's comments regarding, for example, marriage, where went right back to the creation ordinance. In the beginning, God created them male and female. So if you start there, it's quite clear that Jesus believed in Genesis. He believed that that was true. God had made, and this, of course, as you know, Simon, is so relevant in these days, there's only one race. This term racism is a bit of an anomaly, because you can't be a racist unless you're against the human race. I think what we're really talking about is culturism. I don't like this culture or that culture, but we're all one race. We all come from Adam and Eve. Jesus believed that. The gospel writers took that as granted. They never query it. They simply record the words of Jesus. It wasn't in their remit to specifically talk about Genesis, because they were recording the events of the life of Jesus and the disciples. The other New Testament writers later on, of course, they're not under the same constraint. They're not just writing history, and they unquestionably have no doubt at all about the reality of such things as the creation and the worldwide flood, and yes, the miracles of the Old Testament. They record them as matter of fact.
And Luke obviously does have a genealogy, doesn't he, Brian? He traces that.
Thank you for that, Simon. You're absolutely right. He has, and the genealogies, of course, we have to realize that genealogies were not made up. This is what people often forget. Some people are mad keen to find their family tree. Most of us don't really care too much, and we're a bit afraid of who we might come across if we go too far back. But genealogies were absolutely vital in the Old Testament times and into those early New Testament times. Nobody made them up. I could illustrate that, but time wouldn't allow. But when the genealogy is traced right back, as Luke does, to Adam, he's not going so far back and then suddenly pretending that he's made up that they weren't real people. No, he's really illustrating that Jesus came from a line that can be traced right back to Adam. And through that line, it's very important, because God is selecting all the way through his chosen line leading to the Messiah. through David, of course, the king, great David.
Yeah, thanks for that, Brian. One last question. We'll end with this one. It's probably one of the most famous contradictions that people try and bring up regarding the Gospels, and you may guess what it is, Brian. But Matthew obviously records Judas dying by hanging himself on a tree, but Luke says Judas died by falling headlong. Is that a contradiction, or is there a way to understand it?
Well, as a matter of fact, I don't think that's the biggest contradiction, apparent contradiction they pick up. Normally it's the Quirinius one that people get onto, because that's a bit more complicated. This one is pretty straightforward, because actually the two things are true. I'll answer that and then give you a slightly more important answer. Both are true. Why did he not hang himself? And then, as sadly does sometimes happen when people hang themselves, the rope breaks and they fall, and he could have fallen on a rock, and his bowels could have opened. Now, you say you don't know that, to which I reply, but what's wrong with that? You see, what you have to realize, and this is the answer to many of the apparent contradictions in the Gospels, is that each Gospel writer is writing from a different perspective. They're not contradicting. They're simply giving a different aspect to it, and they can all be true. There isn't time to illustrate this, but take another one, and this is I'll just give this illustration because it illustrates it clearly. Never mind who the Gospel writers are. The story of the two blind men who were healed at Jericho. All four Gospel writers mention them, what two of them say there were two men, one only mentions one and gives his name. Is that a contradiction? No, because the others don't say, the writer who mentions only one, which is Luke actually, doesn't actually say it's only one. He simply gives the name, Bartimaeus, because he happens to know the family. So he just mentions the one he knows. But here's the other problem. Some of them say he was coming into Jerusalem, and some of them imply he was leaving Jericho, rather, and some imply he was leaving Jericho. There's a plain contradiction. Who is right? Could not this be the answer? If any of you have been, as some of you must have been, to Jericho as it is today, you'll know that there's modern Jericho and there's the old Jericho. Been there myself. You can stand on the ruins of the city that was knocked about a bit in the time of Joshua. The ruins of old Jericho. And there is a story that comes in the middle of this gospel record. They come into Jerusalem, where Bartimaeus and his colleague are pleading for help, but Jesus ignored them on the first occasion. Walked through the city, met with Zacchaeus, and had tea with Zacchaeus, stayed with Zacchaeus overnight and his family, and moved out afterwards. So they're now leaving Jerusalem and entering Old Jerusalem in the morning, where the healing took place. Now, that is a reasonable explanation. It depends on your perspective of the account, whether you do it at the beginning or the end, whether you put it all in one. But it may have happened in two parts. If you find a reasonable explanation, remember the law of evidence. It has to be proven to be wrong, proven. Otherwise, the account stands.
Yeah, those were helpful evidences, I think you give there at the beginning for us to understand how to understand the gospel. So that's very helpful. And just want to say thank you, Brian, for your time tonight. I know a lot of people who've been watching have found it very helpful. You know, a lot of thank you comments coming in. Brian can't see the comments, by the way, folks. He doesn't see them. I can see them, but I want to pass that on to Brian. People have been watching tonight from America, India, Switzerland, Brian. So you've had a big audience tonight, and so everyone is appreciative of what they've heard. So thank you for your time.
Thank you all.